Welcome back to the deep dive. We are jumping straight into, well, one of the hardest puzzles in the energy transition. How do you actually run a huge, highly industrialized economy entirely on renewables, especially when, your geography seems almost actively working against you? The place we're talking about is Finland. Think long, dark winters, really extreme swings in resource availability. So today our mission is to really unpack this detailed analysis that you sent us. It's a paper titled The Role of Energy Storage Solutions in a 100% Renewable Finnish Energy System. Now it's worth noting this is a bit of an older paper published back in 2016, but it's fascinating because it uses detailed modeling to project a scenario for Finland way out in 2050. And we're here to figure out exactly which storage solutions the model found were, well, most critical to make that 100% renewable future actually work.
Yeah, Finland really is an outstanding stress test for these kinds of energy models. And that's why this study, even though it's from 2016, is still so relevant to look at. The core difficulty, as you said, is that high latitude combined with really strong seasonality. You've got short days, huge heating demands in winter, and then flip side, almost constant sunlight and solar PV potential in the summer months.
That seasonal flip is just massive, isn't it? You might get these bursts of sun and wind in summer, but the time you really need the power, the high demand periods, that's smack bang in the winter when solar generation is, well, practically zero.
Precisely. And okay, they do get pretty strong wind production in the winter, which helps, but it's still variable, right?
Yeah.
So the generation just doesn't naturally line up with when people need the energy. You have to store that intermittent power somehow. And we also need to remember, Finland isn't just, a small residential country. It's technologically advanced, highly industrialized. They absolutely need constant, reliable power. Their existing hydropower is crucial, acts like a great natural battery, but its reservoir capacity is limited. It's about 5.5 TWh, which sounds like a lot, but it only covers maybe 6.5% of their current annual electricity demand.
Okay, so 6.5%, that's definitely not enough to bridge those huge seasonal gaps alone.
Not even close.
So if you need 100% reliability, and that hinges on flexibility, then this study's central idea becomes pretty clear. Storage technologies aren't just a backup plan anymore. They have to be seen as like a core, essential part of the system. They're bridging what the paper calls these major temporal and geographic gaps between when energy is made and when it's actually needed. The big question is which technologies step up.
Right. So let's present how they figured this out, the methodology. They use something called the energy plan model. It's an advanced energy system analysis computer model. This isn't just back of the envelope stuff. Energy plan is used globally to simulate really complex energy flows. And its goal here was to find the most suitable, least cost configuration to hit that 100% renewable target for 2050 using hourly data simulations.
Okay, hourly data, least cost. So what did it find overall? What's the big picture on storage?
Well, the high-level takeaway is definitely, yes, storage is absolutely crucial. When they added up all the stored electricity and heat that was discharged back into the system over the year,
Yeah.
it represented nearly 15% of the total end-user energy demand for that whole year. 15%.
Wow, okay, 15%. To give that some context, that's 25 terawatt hours of energy discharge against about 170 terawatt hours of total annual energy consumption. So put it another way, nearly 1 out of every 7 units of energy used by Finnish homes, industry, everything in this future scenario.
Yeah.
It has to come directly from some kind of storage.
And you can see exactly why that storage reliance is so high when you look at how the variable stuff, the solar PV and the wind actually got used in the model. Right. If we just zoom in on the electricity sector for a moment, solar and wind together contributed a massive chunk, about 60.5% of the final electricity consumption. Huge. But here's the kicker, the key finding. Only about 47% of that variable renewable energy was actually used directly, like the instant it was generated.
Wait, hold on. Less than half? So more than half of all the solar and wind energy generated isn't used right away. I mean, that statistic alone just screams why the system simply cannot function without really robust storage.
It's the absolute critical mechanism for balancing everything.
Yeah.
So roughly 51% of that power went directly into various electric storage solutions. A tiny bit, about 2.5%, ended up being curtailed, basically wasted, but storage was overwhelmingly the main path for using that intermittent power effectively.
Okay, now this is where, for me, the deep dive gets really surprising. Because when we drill down into that electric power sector, where remember, total storage discharge meant 21% of the end-user electricity consumption. The model's results kind of flip our usual idea of what a battery is.
Absolutely. This is the shocker. So total electricity storage discharge was 22.2 TWh. Now, when this model broke down where that stored electricity actually came from, the vast majority, I mean, an astounding 87.2%.
87%?
87.2%. It came from vehicle-to-grid connections, V2G. That's 19.4 TWh, coming from electric vehicles plugged into the grid, essentially acting as this huge, distributed, flexible battery for the system.
Okay, 87%. That doesn't just suggest V2G plays a large role.
Mm.
In this model, it suggests V2G is the strategy for short-term electric storage, pretty much the whole thing. So what about, the big stationary batteries we always hear about, the grid-scale packs?
Almost nothing. Stationary battery storage discharge was minimal. It registered only 0.1 TWh. Because the energy plan model is always searching for the least cost solution, it basically designated stationary batteries as the storage of lowest priority. Essentially, the model assumes if you have that V2G capacity available from all the cars, then building large, separate stationary batteries becomes functionally, well, almost irrelevant compared to the massive, already there capacity provided by the electric vehicle fleet.
Okay, but this raises massive questions about the model's assumptions, right? About VDG actually happening at that scale. To get to that 87% dominance, the model has to assume not just a huge number of EVs on the road, but crucially, really high levels of user cooperation. That people are actually willing to plug in consistently and let their car batteries discharge energy when the grid needs it most.
That's the absolute hinge point, and the study does, to its credit, explore these real-world implications. They point out, interestingly, that Finns are already kind of used to plugging their cars in regularly, mostly for block heaters in the winter. So they suggest there might be a sort of cultural predisposition, maybe less resistance to engaging in V2G behavior compared to other places.
Maybe. But is plugging in your car so the engine starts in the cold really the same psychological step as plugging it in to sell energy back to the grid?
Yeah.
Potentially risking the battery charge you might need later? That feels different.
It does feel different. And beyond the sociology, there are the big technical hurdles. This study specifically flags that the current Finnish local grids, the low-voltage distribution networks, your neighborhood wires, and typical home connections, they might not physically be able to handle the high power flows needed for widespread VDG services.
Okay. So the pipes aren't big enough, basically.
Exactly. Getting 19.4 TWh of discharge from V2G implies a massive upgrade, a total overhaul of that local infrastructure, which then brings up an even deeper question that the study notes. Are stationary batteries actually even necessary in the long run if you could solve the V2G infrastructure problem? Or is the effort, the investment, better focused solely on upgrading the distribution grid to unlock this huge potential from cars? The study admits that's beyond its scope, but yeah, the finding is stark.
Okay, so V2G in this model is the powerhouse for handling the daily ups and downs, the shock absorbing for the electric grid. But Finland is cold, really cold. The bigger, maybe tougher challenge is surviving the winter without losing power or heat. Let's shift gears away from just electricity and look at that huge thermal energy demand. What was the total? 65.3 TWh of heat.
Yeah, 65.3 TWh thermal. Now, thermal energy storage, or TES, played a much smaller role, at least in the annual figures reported. Thermal storage discharge only amounted to 2.8 TWh thermal, which represents just 4.3% of the end-user heat demand annually. That seems quite minimal when you think about how critical heating is there.
4%. Yeah, that feels surprisingly low for a place like Finland. Why wasn't it more significant in the model?
Well, there's a really important modeling caveat here. The energy plan model, by default, it treats the entire country's energy system as effectively one single heating system. And when you model it that way, as one big interconnected unit, the vast seasonal storage provided by power to gas, which we'll get to next, looks cheaper and more effective for balancing the whole system centrally. And building lots of distributed thermal storage tanks.
So the way the model was set up might have artificially downplayed the need for local thermal storage.
Exactly. The authors are quite careful to point this out. They suggest that if the system were modeled more realistically, perhaps broken down into smaller regional district heating networks, you would likely see much, much greater use and reliance on thermal storage, especially during those critical autumn and winter periods. It really proves its worth in balancing things out regionally, even if the big national annual number looks small.
Okay. That makes a lot more sense. So we've got VDG for the short-term electric balancing, TES potentially playing a bigger role locally for heat. Now we get to the real heavy lifter for bridging those long, cold, dark seasons. Chemical storage, mainly through power to gas, or PTG.
Right. PTG is the key technology here for bridging the deepest time gaps, months-long gaps. It works by taking excess electricity, often from wind power, during very windy periods when demand is low, and converting it into a storable chemical fuel, like synthetic hydrogen or methane. And this gas can then be stored, potentially in massive underground salt caverns or old gas fields, for months on end. It provides a true seasonal backstop.
And the scale of this seasonal gas storage in the model, it wasn't trivial, was it?
No, it was massive. This gas storage, which came from a mix of PTG but also biomass gasification and some biogas generation, it provided a really critical buffer. The total grid gas storage discharge was 14.0 TWF gas. That represented over a quarter, 26.5% of the annual grid gas consumption in the model. So it really demonstrates PTG's vital function for long-term balancing.
So essentially, this lets the system soak up huge amounts of intermittent renewable energy, store it for months,
Yeah.
and then deploy it later to provide reliable baseload energy, whether that's for generating electricity, providing heat, or even for mobility exactly when the variable generation, the wind and solar, is at its absolute lowest point, often deep in that cold, dark winter peak.
Exactly. And the study authors noted that these findings for the role of PTG were actually very much in line with similar energy system studies done for Germany. It reinforces this idea that for any 100% renewable energy system that doesn't have enormous amounts of seasonal hydro storage, chemical storage like PTG becomes pretty much non-negotiable for system survival through the seasons.
Okay, so that paints a pretty clear picture of the storage hierarchy in this 2050 scenario. V2G dominating daily electric balance, TES important for regional heat, and PTG is the essential seasonal chemical storage. But before we kind of wrap this all up, we have to touch on the existing powerhouse in Finland, their hydro capacity.
Yes, absolutely. The study makes sure to point out this significant existing asset. Up to 20% of Finland's end-user electricity consumption can be supplied by their hydropower. And crucially, the model, as it was run for this paper, didn't fully explore the total potential flexibility that could be squeezed out of that hydro storage.
That sounds like potentially a major variable that wasn't fully optimized in this specific run.
It seems so. The authors clearly suggest that harnessing even more flexibility from hydropower production because, let's face it, hydro dams are the most cost-effective and proven form of large-scale energy storage we have.
Right.
Doing that could significantly lessen the need for building out some of the other storage capacity, particularly expensive assets like, say, large stationary batteries, or maybe even reducing the total amount of PDG production needed. So maximizing this existing low-cost hydro flexibility is clearly presented as like the first logical step to potentially reducing the overall system costs compared to the baseline model run.
Okay, so what does this all mean when we put the entire 2050 scenario, modeled back in this 2016 paper, together for you listening?
I think the core takeaway is that getting to 100% renewable energy, especially in a really challenging climate like Finland's, it requires not just one silver bullet, but a complex mix, a whole toolkit of complementary storage solutions. The model pointed towards a system really founded on maximizing that existing hydro first. Then, for daily electric balancing, it relied overwhelmingly on an assumed massive deployment of vehicle-to-grid. That was complemented by essential seasonal chemical storage via power-to-gas and supported by necessary, though perhaps under-modeled at the national level, thermal storage for heat.
Yeah, this study definitely confirms that variable renewables, wind and solar, along with energy storage solutions can, in theory, play a huge role in a 100% renewable energy future for Finland. But the specifics of how the model achieved that reliability, particularly that extreme reliance on V2G, are, well, they're entirely non-traditional compared to how we often think about grid storage today. Yeah, definitely food for thought. Now that brings us nicely to our final thought for you to mull over. The model works beautifully on paper, right? It shows this least cost pathway to a 100% RE Finland.
But given that surprising, almost shocking dominance of vehicle-to-grid in this specific model, remember, 87% of electric storage discharge, what fundamental societal and infrastructural changes have to happen first? Specifically, right down at the level of local low-voltage distribution grids, the wires in your street, and also in consumer behavior, before such a radical storage solution like mass V2G can actually move from being just a scenario in a computer model to becoming an everyday reliable reality. It's that gap, isn't it? The gap between the theoretical terawatt hours in the spreadsheet and the practical reality of the copper wiring in the street and people's willingness to participate. That still feels like maybe the greatest barrier.
An excellent point. It really highlights the difference between a successful simulation and a successful real-world implementation. Well, thank you for sharing this fascinating source material with us. The role of energy storage solutions in a 100% renewable Finnish energy system. That was a truly insightful deep dive today.